Today's episode continues to pull on a thread that began a couple of episodes ago, when we spoke to people like Rebecca Riakatimbo. And that's the body of work that sees people and communities as the fundamental building blocks of any system. This is in contrast to those maybe who take a more state-centric approach, or those who see industry, especially a globalized technology sector, as being the architects, the engines of growth and of innovation. In an era of big tech and big government, today's guest, Astha Kapoor, sees a role for big people. Individuals who harness the power of collective bargaining to negotiate new relationships with technology platforms, with infrastructure, to imagine new ways of building accountability and trust, and fundamentally to continue to assert their worth, their dignity, in a system that often sees people simply as a source of data for the technology systems of the future. Now, while she draws primarily from her work in India, she has lessons and messages that will resonate with audiences around the world. Welcome to AI, Alternative Intelligence, a podcast brought to you by Data2X. Each episode, we talk to guests who help us to learn, to question, and be inspired by what's possible when we focus on equity in innovation, especially around AI. I'm your host, Anand Verghese, and I'm really excited to welcome this week's guest, Astha Kapoor. She's the co-founder and director of the Aapti Institute, a research and think tank based in Bangalore, India, which coincidentally also happens to be my hometown. At Aapti, she works on new models for data sharing, stewardship, and governance. Astha, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
For many of our listeners, the Aapti Institute may be new. I'd love for you to start by sharing what inspired you to found it and how your team works on these topics of data, governance, digital public infrastructure, and how has that work evolved really over time?
So we set up Aapti in 2019, my co-founder and I. Sarayu, my co-founder, is a lawyer who was in 2014 doing her PhD, and this was the big election with all kinds of technologies such as holograms being deployed all over India. And at the same time, I was working in the planning commission, the organization which is now known as Niti Aayog. And I always say, had box seats to India's process of digitalization because I worked there between 2010 and 12. And, that's when the Aadhaar project started. We started thinking about direct benefits transfers. So there was a lot of excitement about the process of digitalization in India in those moments. But as sort of time went by and both Sarayu and I spent more and more time in the field, we realized that there was obviously a lot more than the sort of magic of digitalization, which is like, oh, you send money from your phone to people and, you can authenticate in a tiny machine in the middle of nowhere. We realized there was a huge human cost to it. And so we were introduced by a common friend and we realized that we had the same questions, which is like, what is tech doing to people? How are people navigating and negotiating with technology, and what needs to be done from the social science perspective to really understand this better? Because I had just moved to Bangalore. Sarayu is from Bangalore, and as Bangalore is very much at the heart of the build ecosystem in India. And the governance all happens out of Delhi. And what we also thought is that in the two groups that exist in India, which is the people who build and the people who try to regulate, there aren't a lot of people who are trying to understand what's going on. And with that in mind, we set up Aapti to understand how technology changes our relationship with our work, our government, and then also ourselves, which is the increasingly datafied lives that we all live in. We started this in 2019, and the world was a very different place at that time. And, it felt in many ways that we were a little bit ahead with our questions. But thank God for that, because, 7 years later, we realized that a lot of the questions we were asking, particularly around things like, we started thinking about gig work, but now 7 years later, there's a lot of data labelers that are involved, right? So people who are labeling data through gigified mechanisms for large language models. We started looking at data stewardship really early as well, which is, what are the models that go beyond consent and notice as a governance mechanism. And now again, you sort of fast forward to this like, AI boom, and we're coming back to a lot of the questions around how do we make sure that data is not being exploited, extracted, misused by large language models. So I think that you asked about the journey. I think the journey has been an interesting one, largely because so many of the questions that we started off with keep finding new relevance in this time. And it really is, a joyful thing to be able to engage with a lot of this, to be part of a women-led, women majority organization, which we're very thrilled about, and one that sort of is constantly trying to bring that socio-political perspective on tech and its regulation.
I'm curious. You said the questions have sort of cycled around. They were relevant at a particular time, 5, 6, 7 years ago. They're newly relevant again, perhaps. I'm curious about the answers and what the market for the answers has been. The results of your research, the results of your questions. Has there been an increased demand, a difference in the demand that you have, either from government or private sector or other consumers of your research? Has that landscape changed at all in the time since you've started?
Yeah, well, research has changed, right? I think that both in terms of the sort of competition we have with the attention economy, which is that nobody reads anymore. So we have to do nifty things like podcasts, but also the fact that the value of the written word, when ChatGPT can churn it out in like less than 30 seconds, something that might take you and I, days and years of research and thinking and analysis to do, really does change a lot of how people view that sort of output, if I may put it like, very loosely. So in that context, I do feel that we have been thinking more and more about the value of our own work. We do believe that there is an enormous need for evidence, right? And I think that the major problem with the way large language models function is that they exist in a certain time, right? And there's no new and current evidence that is being made available. And so I think that that rigor is really important. And so we continue to bat for empirical work that is in the weeds with the people to try to understand what's going on. And there is still appetite for that. And I have to say, maybe even a slight, so, these things are cyclical, like you said. And so there's always ebbs and flows in what people want and are interested in. In 2022, I guess, when this boom had happened, we were like, that's it, research is dead, there's no need for this anymore. And then as the crisis, and I call it a crisis in a certain way because it is, of artificial intelligence deepens and we grapple to figure out how to deal with it, I think that research and evidence becomes important again. So I feel very optimistically that we're on an upcycle for the appetite for research and evidence and work like us. We also do more than research, which is that we now, over the years, have realized that actually what we were doing as always was action research, right? How do you go from what you learn on the field and how do you embed that in processes, whether it's on platforms or in policy or in community-based organizations? How do you make sure that gap between what's going on the ground to what is actually being implemented at various levels is, shorter, more efficient, and based on feedback loops versus just, you did a piece of research and it's a 3 year long, you know randomized control trial, and then you see results, but everyone's like gone from being 3 years old to 12. So I think that that's also what we're trying to do. And we're also increasingly doing, trainings. We use play-based trainings to make sure that a lot of the stuff that we produce is actually embedded in people's minds. And we also do, we're interested in seeing how we can build more playbooks and handbooks and make a lot of this more lived and embedded versus things that lie on the shelves.
I want to shift our conversation. I think it's a good segue into the practical to talk a little bit about these models of data stewardship that you kind of referenced earlier, especially around cooperative and more participatory models. What is a data cooperative? What does it look like in practice? How does it shift power, perhaps between individuals and communities? And I'd love for you to contextualize that within this sort of AI-driven trend that we're seeing. How does it change things for AI models, the data that trains these systems?
Yeah, so I'll have to get into a little bit of like the backstory, which is that we were working on data cooperatives, which is just from a very purely data lens to say, and to define data cooperatives, it is an an entity in which people are members, much like they are in co-ops, which is, groups of people, one member, one vote. And in the same way as cooperatives pool labor and capital and govern it through a board, the idea is that, members would be able to pool data and govern it collectively to extract better value from it, as well as negotiate better with platforms. We began studying data cooperatives as Aapti in 2019, where we realized that these cooperatives were being constructed in different parts of the world. One instance out of Switzerland was that there was an under-researched ailment where patients of that ailment had come together to pool data and then make that data available to researchers to specifically investigate that particular ailment. Another example was out of California, where a data cooperative was set up by organizers for drivers on ride-hailing apps, and it was made into a board with 51% drivers, and they were able to again pool their data and figure out things like, in route A to route B, Grab is giving you better rates versus Lyft, for instance. So there was a lot of value back to drivers by giving them a better sense of how to make decisions. And then the objective was also to unlock some of this data for municipalities to make better decisions, because drivers have all of this civic data. And the more sort of loftier aim, and I don't know if they ever got to it, was to use this data to negotiate with platforms such as Uber and Lyft and all of that. So we'd been studying these examples, but then serendipitously we were introduced to Bapu, who's a fellow at or senior fellow at Data2X, and Bapu was about to lead the 17 Rooms effort, which is something that Rockefeller Foundation organizes to look at different SDGs. And Bapu and I led, or co-led one of the groups together. And that also helped us understand that data cooperatives had a very specific gender lens, because so many of the cooperatives exist in agriculture, and so much of agriculture is feminized. And so since then, we've been looking at understanding, enabling, activating, choose your verb, data cooperatives in agriculture, particularly for women. And in the last, I want to say, 3.5 years with Data2X, we've done a lot of work on supporting existing cooperatives to add that data layer, because we realized that making new institutions is quite hard. And when you already have cooperatives that exist in the world. And, this is one of my favorite facts, which was told to me by a friend in the cooperative movement, that 1 out of 10 people is already a member of the cooperative globally. So when you have such ubiquity of this institutional structure that runs, in Basque Country, one of the biggest industries, Mondragon, that owns everything from like factories to petrol stations to everything. This is an instrument that you can deploy in the new economy with data, with on the same governance principles as what cooperatives have always stood for, which is democratic distribution of value, decision making and participation, and then the ability to safeguard the interests of their members through collective action.
I'm curious about this model of the cooperative, because it seems to me that part of this value extraction or democratization of value is in the implicit ability for individuals and communities to hold back data when they don't want to give it up. And yet so much of what we're experiencing as participants in that kind of in a kind of technology universe is that our data is collected passively, maybe without us even knowing. Just by participating in society, in many ways you're giving up a lot of information about yourself. In many ways AI has accelerated that by pulling data from wherever across the internet, across people's data. What is your sense of is the scale of cooperatives? You said 1 in 10 people are members of cooperatives, perhaps not data cooperatives, but is the scale of cooperatives large enough to actually hold back this trend of data being extracted from us regardless of our desire to do so?
I think that the right to say no to that extraction is only one of the features that I think data cooperatives can help achieve. I think there are others, like I said, which may help redirect the value of data, or uh, ask for greater accountability on how that data is being used. So, for instance, as I mentioned, the example of the patients' data rights group, what they were doing is redirecting their own data to better understand their own disease, right? Which is something that maybe pharmaceutical companies or academic researchers hadn't necessarily thought, but because they were able to organize and mobilize themselves and say, hey, we're a data group, we are organized, and now we demand that, somebody research this for us. And I think that's a really interesting example of how we are able to create greater agency around how our data is used. Another example is around accountability, which is, say, for instance, again, in the context of healthcare, you have again a disease, you're part of a randomized control trial or whatever it is, and we do a lot of work on biorepositories, for instance. So it could be that you're organized as a cooperative, and the board says, hey, you can use this data for research, but let's not use this to determine premiums for this collective, right? And if you do, then we're going to withdraw. So there is a great, I mean, the objective is collective bargaining, right? And that collective bargaining can do a bunch of different things, though the objective is to make sure that the interests of the members are safeguarded in the context of data extraction, in the context of certain platforms hoarding the value from our data. And the objective is to create these cooperatives which are hefty with, we have a paper my co-author Mila Sandub and I have written on the idea of a new right to infrastructure. And what we are calling for is the big public, because what we keep seeing is that there's the big tech and big government, and what cooperatives are to me is the big public. And that's what we're trying to create.
Uh, Another perfect segue to a topic I wanted to discuss, which is sort of digital public infrastructure. If anything um, seems to embody this union between big tech and big government, it is the kind of digital public infrastructure. Of course, India is famously the sort of poster child around the world for this through Aadhaar. But um, you've written a lot about a more kind of bottom-up governance model, a more people-centric approach to digital systems, digital public infrastructure, especially when it's designed for welfare or social inclusion. What does that look like in practicality? What does a big people version of that look like?
I gave a talk this morning also around this, which is from the perspective of sovereignty, because so much of the recent discussion, particularly with changing politics in your part of the world, has been around sovereignty and how do we exercise it digitally, right? So sovereignty was all about controlling our borders and national security, and now that's obviously been translated to the control of cloud and everything, the digital infrastructure, data. And so I think that in the context of digital public infrastructure, there are interesting ways through which you can exercise your sovereignty. And the paper I wrote, which is forthcoming, is about the idea of micro sovereignty, which is how do you create these these little pools where communities have the opportunity to exercise their own sovereignty over digital infrastructure. And to me, again, like cooperatives are a great example of that. We've seen some of this happen in platforms such as Mastodon, where communities are able to coalesce and use that open infrastructure to exercise a certain kind of agency over their small ecosystem. So there's instances of community governed broadbands out of Brazil. So there are opportunities where you can coalesce around digital infrastructure, which is also in some ways the vision for how DPI was also first started, which is that we would make it open, we would make it as an equal playing field for different kinds of people. However, openness is not without issue. Openness can be captured. We've seen this also happen. Openness can be used as market capture strategies, and a lot has been written about open washing more recently. And so I don't think this is an easy thing to solve for, but the glimmer of opportunity I see in all of this is that if we have a collective capacity to exercise agency, to govern infrastructures and claim them for ourselves in a bottom up mechanism, I think that changes some of the broader issues around DPI, which have been more top down, more led by bigger actors with less ability to negotiate through the bottom up than we would have liked them to be.
And is that initial vision of openness perhaps a slightly more democratic, or I don't know, I don't want to overuse the word democratic, but perhaps a slightly more decentralized um, version of human agency and human flourishing within a kind of technology frame? Has that been taken away? Why is that initial vision not really come to fruition? Is that purely because of market capture, or is it because of political dynamics? What is preventing that initial vision from coming up, and how are the communities that you're trying to build kind of helping to bring that vision to fruition, you think?
I think that it could be all of the above in a certain way. I think that openness was offered from the early internet as a silver bullet. And then, of course, the walled gardens came up, and we know how that story is gone. And then again, it became lack of maintenance. It became the fact that across the supply chain, as recently the AWS outage showed us, that even open platforms rely on closed big tech clouds, right? So I think that the embeddedness of certain infrastructures even within that open ecosystem has meant a certain kind of dependency. I think that there's also been a lot of open washing, which is that we don't know if it's fully open source, if it's just an open API. So people just use that word. I was recently in a very irate conversation to be like, what is open? Which I think a lot of us feel, which is that, everyone has a different definition, everyone has a different standard. We also know that, again, open data is being completely vacuumed up by models. So is that a virtue at this point? So I think that, and we've also fully failed to govern the notion of openness because it became such a moral high ground. And so once you're so far up the high ground, then there's no need to govern it, because once you agree to something as virtuous as openness, then who needs governance? So I think it's a combination of all of this. And I think that for many people, it also became an opportunity. And as we've seen in the context of, um, places like Llama, which is an open source tool, and it can be argued is is a digital public good, but then is it really? I think becomes a question. So I think it's a complicated answer, and I think that a lot of people are trying to make sense of it. We also know that the thing that we thought was going to be the way that we exercise our agency, which is the idea of the commons, the openness, and open science, and all of that. I think that's what's being weaponized and commodified, and kind of, reducing the space for the public to play. So I think that in that context, then it becomes about power, and the only way to sort of renegotiate power is through collective bargaining and collective capacity and a push to participation, which is why I'm very bullish on data cooperatives.
Yeah, I'm interested because more AI is more AI tools are going to become part of the way governments provide services, the way they manage their business. Is that bottom up model um, in some way going to help communities extract more value from the governments that is trying to serve them? Is it going to increase the kind of power differential between citizen and state? What is your sense of where data cooperatives and this kind of more community or bottom up approach might help in a sort of AI driven future, especially in that relationship between citizen and state?
So I think that, like I said, I think that it becomes an alternative institution that is driven by members. And what's interesting is that I recently read an article to say, like, let's not again make such a big virtue of cooperatives, because at the end of the day, they only serve members and not non-members, and there's complexities in that too. But I hope we will all be members of co-ops one day. But I think that the reason I rely on cooperatives in my head as the solution is because we need optimism, and there needs to be some way of institutionalizing that, and I think that cooperatives do that for me. I think that I'm also optimistic because I see some recognition of this notion of collective rights in various documents of the world sporadically. So, data cooperatives were in the Global Digital Compact, and they were in some EU DSA, DMA, I forget, DGA, documentation as well. In India, they were mentioned in a, parliamentary committee report on non-personal data. So there's like, they come up every now and then. And what we're also seeing in work that, again, like I must mention, that we've been doing with Data 2X in Asia, is actually seeing that while it may not be cooperatives as the way that we define them in this like structured way, there are mechanisms of bottom up sovereignty. There are mechanisms of fishing communities coming together, stewarding data on behalf of their people, making, information available back to community, using that information to enhance productivity. We're seeing that in Kerala, in India, there is a bank cooperative and an enthusiastic citizen that has used agricultural data to move back to more traditional rice growth and make sure that there is more livelihood and income for that farming community. So we are looking for, and so the examples that we've been studying are for climate action. And what we are realizing is that it may not be a data issue, but if it is an issue, for instance, there is invariably some data attached to it, and communities are able to steward it. Because when so much of our lives are collective, particularly around agriculture, and we realize that that singular cutting of data, which is that this is your singular ID number, this is your singular bank account, this is your singular phone number, actually atomizes us in a way that we don't do to ourselves. So people work collectively, particularly in agriculture, and we're finding that in that intersection between agriculture and climate action and women, gender, there's a lot of data stewardship that occurs where people are willing to make decisions together in the interest of the collective and not in the interest of the individual.
That brings me to some work that you've been doing about trust in digital systems in technology, especially among women. What is your current sense of this, at least amongst the communities that you're working with? And do they see these cooperatives as perhaps becoming trust building models for themselves?
So we see, I mean, the short answer from our 2-year long work on trust is that if women in particular, and I must, caveat this, that this was a piece of work done in India, though I'm fairly certain it is applicable to other parts of the world as well, because we've talked to, partners in Southeast Asia and Eastern Africa, and a lot of what we discovered in our work resonates. But the idea is that if women are given shared spaces to experiment and fail at technology things, making a transaction, setting up a profile, whatever, then they are more likely to be trusting, um but not over trusting. And there's a line, we call it the trust line, which is like you can't be gullible and then be defrauded, and you can't be arrogant and then be defrauded, but you cannot be skeptical and then not use. So there's some balance in this. But what we believe is that women who are in self-help groups or some kind of cooperative or collective structures are more likely to be able to turn around to a friend and be like, hey, should I send this prince all the money that they're asking me for, or should I maybe not do it? And then somebody will be like, don't do that. And therefore your ability to build confidence in yourself, your ability to build trust in your technology is heightened if you are doing it in a collective setting. So what we've been also advocating for is that trust is online, is support offline, and we need to create those offline infrastructures, which is why again collectives are really important to women's trust in tech. Because in the absence of that, what we've realized is that women already have, again, I speak for India, already have very low self-confidence. They also have a lot of shame attached to failure. They also have a lot of fear attached to the digital ecosystem. There's layers of patriarchy, which is already telling you that bad things will happen to you if you venture out on the internet. And so that combination is debilitating, and therefore women make mistakes and then have a lot of shame attached to it. They'll go offline, they won't use it, and so it just set us back a little bit. But if we're able to create an offline architecture that lifts women up from those fears, then trust is a more easily negotiated thing. And I don't say trust is built, it's negotiated. And that's what our work showed us.
Well, listen, Asa, I think that is a great place to end this conversation. Thanks so much for the work that you've been doing. Thank you for explaining it also clearly to all of us in the audience. I look forward to hearing how all of this work goes. And thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. And also, shout out to Data2X, without whom we wouldn't have done all of this work. So
Absolutely. We appreciate it.